the 17th of January 1944. The sky above Brunswick, Germany hung grey and heavy, pregnant with winter cold. At 27,000 feet, the air was thin enough to kill a man in minutes without oxygen, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in seconds. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler sat in the cramped cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, his breath fogging against the inside of his canopy, despite the heating system labouring against the altitude. Below him, the Reich stretched out in patches of white and brown, the industrial heart of Germany beating somewhere beneath the cloud cover. His gloved hands rested on the control column with the casual confidence of a man who had done this 487 times before, who had sent 28 enemy aircraft spiralling earthward in flames. Then he saw them. They came from the west like a plague of locusts, darkening the winter sky. Not a handful, not a squadron, hundreds of them. Boeing B-17 flying fortresses, their silver fuselages catching what little sunlight penetrated the overcast, flying in combat boxes so tight and disciplined they seemed like a single mechanical organism. Stigler had seen American bombers before. He had fought them, bled them, sent them down. But never like this. Never so many, never so impossibly, abundantly many. He keyed his radio, his voice steady despite what he was seeing. Achtung! Heavies bearing 270, altitude 8,000 meters. Formation. Gott, I am Himmel. Formation extends beyond visual range. What Stigler could not know, what no amount of Luftwaffe intelligence briefings had adequately prepared him for, was that he was witnessing the physical manifestation of American industrial power in its most terrible and beautiful form. Each of those bombers carried 8,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition distributed across 13 M2 Browning machine guns. His entire Jagdgeschwader 36 fighters on a good day carried perhaps 6,000 rounds total between them, 200 rounds per gun in the MG 151 cannons, 400 inches, the cowl-mounted MG 131 seconds. The American formation before him carried more ammunition than his entire fighter wing could expend in a month of combat. But on that frozen January morning, as Stigler advanced his throttle and felt the Daimler-Benz engine respond with its characteristic howl, he did not yet understand what he was truly facing. He was about to learn what every German fighter pilot would eventually learn, usually in the moment before they died. America did not fight wars. America manufactured victory and shipped it across the Atlantic in quantities that defied human comprehension. The mythology of the fighter ace was ancient even in 1944, though fighter aviation itself was barely 30 years old. It reached back to the knights of medieval Europe, to the samurai of feudal Japan, to the notion that war was ultimately decided by the skill and courage of individual warriors locked in personal combat. The Germans understood this mythology better than anyone. They had, after all, invented it in its modern form. Manfred von Richthofen. The Red Baron. 80 confirmed victories before a bullet found him over the Somme in 1918. Ernst Udet, 62 kills, who performed aerobatics at county fairs in peacetime, who drank champagne from ladies' shoes, and embodied everything glamorous about aviation. Werner Mulders, the first man to surpass Richthofen's record, who developed the finger four formation that revolutionized fighter tactics. These were the gods in whose shadows men like Stigler flew. These were the men whose examples proved that individual excellence, individual courage, individual skill could decide the fate of nations. The Luftwaffe, in 1944, still believed in this mythology, even as the evidence mounted daily against it. They painted kill markings on their fuselages, with the care of artists signing masterpieces. They awarded the Knight's Cross to pilots who achieved the mystical fifth kill. They promoted men based on victory tallies and gave them positions of honor in the fighter arm. The ace was not merely a skilled pilot. He was proof that Germanic superiority was real, measurable, quantifiable. Every downed enemy aircraft validated the entire ideological framework of the Reich. Adolf Galland, the General der Jagdflieger himself, had 68 confirmed kills by January 1944. He wore his Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords everywhere, smoked cigars in defiance of regulations, and spoke with the authority of a man who had personally destroyed more than a squadron's worth of enemy aircraft with his own hands. When Galland spoke about aerial combat, he spoke about initiative, about aggression, about the hunting instinct. He spoke about the individual will imposing itself on chaos. What Galland did not speak about, what perhaps he could not allow himself to fully acknowledge, was that individual will meant nothing against the sheer crushing weight of industrial production. That skill was irrelevant when the enemy could absorb casualties that would cripple any other nation and return the next day with more aircraft than before. That all the courage and excellence in the world could not overcome an enemy who treated airplanes the way other nations treated rifle ammunition as expendable resources to be manufactured and deployed in whatever quantities the mission required. The Americans did not have aces in the same way the Germans did. They had pilots, certainly, and some became famous, but the culture was fundamentally different. An American fighter pilot who destroyed 5 enemy aircraft received recognition, but he was not considered a different species of warrior. He was simply a man doing his job slightly better than average. The USAAF rotated pilots home after completing their tour, pulling experienced men out of combat when they were most effective, because the institution mattered more than the individual. They treated their pilots as they treated everything else in their military machine, as components that could be replaced when worn out. This philosophical difference manifested itself in 1,000 practical ways, but nowhere more dramatically than in ammunition loadout. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, the most common German fighter in early 1944, carried 2 13mm MG 131 machine guns mounted above the engine, with 300 rounds per gun, and one 20mm MG 151 over 20 cannon, firing through the propeller hub with 200 rounds. A well-trained pilot could expend this entire ammunition supply in approximately 40 seconds of sustained fire. 40 seconds. Then the aircraft was reduced to a spectator, forced to return to base, land, and wait while ground crew manually reloaded each gun from ammunition cans hauled from dispersed storage bunkers, a process that took anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes under ideal conditions. The Focke-Wulf 490A8 carried slightly more. 4 20mm MG 151 over 20 cannons in the wings with 250 rounds each, and 2 13mm MG 131 seconds in the fuselage with 475 rounds each. This provided perhaps 50 seconds of sustained fire before the pilot was similarly neutered, forced to withdraw, forced to concede the sky to the enemy, while ground crew performed their laborious ballet of ammunition cans and feed mechanisms. Contrast this with the Boeing B-17G Flying Fortress, 13 M2 Browning, 50 caliber machine guns, 2 in the chin turret beneath the nose, 2 in the top turret behind the cockpit, 2 in the ball turret beneath the fuselage, 2 in the tail, 1 in each waist position, 1 in the radio room. Each gun fed from ammunition boxes, holding between 400 and 600 rounds depending on position. Total ammunition load, approximately 8,000 rounds per aircraft. At the standard rate of fire of 750 to 800 rounds per minute per gun, a B-17 could theoretically sustain continuous fire from all positions for 45 seconds. But no bomber ever did this because ammunition was allocated to specific threat vectors and managed carefully by trained gunners who understood fire discipline. In practice, a B-17 carried enough ammunition to engage enemy fighters aggressively throughout an entire mission lasting 8 to 10 hours, from the moment it crossed into hostile airspace until the moment it returned to England. Gunners could afford to fire warning bursts, deterrent bursts, speculative bursts at anything that moved within range. They could afford to be wasteful because wastefulness was built into American doctrine at the most fundamental level. But ammunition load was only the beginning of the disparity. Hauptmann Johannes Steinhoff, who would survive the war with 176 confirmed victories and later become a general in the post-war Luftwaffe, wrote in his memoirs about the first time he truly understood what his squadron was facing. It was February 1944, over Frankfurt, during a raid that put more than 1,000 American bombers over Germany in a single day. His Jagdgruppe had scrambled with 17 serviceable aircraft. 17. They had lost 4 in the previous week to combat damage and mechanical failure, and the replacement pipeline had dried to a trickle as factories were bombed and rail networks disrupted. Trained pilots were becoming scarce. Spare parts were being hoarded like gold. His ground crew was cannibalizing 3 damaged aircraft to keep one flying. This was the new mathematics of the Luftwaffe. Scarcity, compounding scarcity, until the entire structure threatened to collapse under its own decrepit weight. His fighters climbed to intercept altitude, burning precious fuel that was increasingly synthetic, increasingly contaminated with impurities that fouled engines and reduced performance. They formed up in the Finger Four, swarm formation that had served them so well in Poland and France and over England, back when they were the hunters and the world was their prey. Then the Americans arrived. Steinhoff counted bombers until he reached 100 and stopped counting. They flew in staggered combat boxes, each box containing 18 to 21 aircraft, each box positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. Above them, around them, behind them, flew the escort fighters Republic P-47 Thunderbolts that looked more like flying tanks than aircraft, grotesquely large, impossibly numerous. Steinhoff's intelligence briefing had mentioned escort fighters would be present. The briefing had not mentioned there would be more escort fighters than his entire Geschwader had seen in 6 months. The tactics that had worked in 1940, that had worked in 1941 and 1942, required the fighter to close to point-blank range, 200 meters, 150 meters, close enough to see the rivets in the enemy's fuselage before firing, close enough to ensure hits with the limited ammunition supply. German pilots were trained to hold fire until they could not miss, to make every round count, to treat their ammunition as the precious resource it was. But closing to 200 meters of a B-17 formation meant running a gauntlet of coordinated defensive fire from dozens of aircraft simultaneously. It meant flying through a 3-dimensional cone of destruction, where 50-caliber rounds filled the air so thickly that survival was more probability than skill. Steinhoff watched one of his pilots, a 20-year-old lieutenant named Becker, who had seemed so eager that morning, make his attack run exactly as trained. Becker's Furv 190 approached from the classic high-side angle, diving with the sun behind him, lining up for the perfect deflection shot. The B-17 seconds opened fire at 800 meters. Steinhoff would remember this detail because it seemed impossible. 800 meters was beyond effective range for defensive fire, a waste of ammunition according to every tactical manual ever written. But the Americans did not care about wasting ammunition. They cared about filling the air with metal, about creating a barrier of bullets so dense that probability alone would achieve what precision could not. Becker's aircraft flew into that barrier at 650 kilometers per hour. Later, when Steinhoff reviewed the engagement in his mind, he calculated that Becker probably encountered somewhere between 200 and 300 individual rounds during his 5-second attack run. Perhaps a dozen hit the aircraft. One penetrated the cockpit. Becker's Focke-Wulf snapped into an inverted spin and fell away. The pilot already dead or unconscious, the aircraft suddenly reduced from a weapon system to an expensive coffin. Steinhoff pressed his own attack, achieved firing position, held the trigger for perhaps 3 seconds, expending roughly 100 rounds of cannon ammunition and 200 rounds of machine gun ammunition, nearly 1/4 of his total supply, and saw his shells strike home. The B-17 he had targeted trailed smoke from its No. 3 engine. A victory, perhaps, if the aircraft failed to return to England, but probably not, because American bombers had a disturbing tendency to absorb damage that would destroy any German aircraft and continue flying. He pulled away, his hands shaking slightly from adrenaline and the sustained G-forces of combat maneuvering. His radio crackled with voices, other pilots reporting ammunition exhausted, one reporting his hydraulic system damaged, another simply screaming before his transmission cut off abruptly. The American formation flew on, barely disturbed, perhaps 5 aircraft visibly damaged out of more than 300 present. Steinhoff had enough ammunition for one more attack, perhaps 2 if he was stingy. Around him, his squadron was already fragmenting, pilots with empty guns withdrawing, pilots low on fuel heading for home, pilots with damaged aircraft trying to reach friendly airfields before catastrophic failure. They had been in combat for less than 10 minutes. The Americans would be over Germany for another 3 hours, bombing at will, their gunners still equipped with thousands of rounds per aircraft, their escorts still fresh and deadly. This was the moment Steinhoff understood with crystal clarity. The war was over. Not today, perhaps not even this year, but eventually and inevitably. Because you cannot defeat an enemy who can expend in one mission more ammunition than you can manufacture in a month. Because quantity has a quality all its own when the quantity differential is this extreme. Because courage and skill mean nothing against an opponent who has industrialized warfare to the point where human variables become irrelevant. The mythology of the fighter ace required the belief that the individual mattered, that one exceptional man could change the course of battle. But the reality of industrial warfare was that the individual mattered less with every passing month, every passing year. The Americans understood this instinctively in a way the Germans never fully did, because American culture had spent a century perfecting mass production before the war even began. Henry Ford did not invent the automobile, but he invented the system that made automobiles cheap enough for common workers to afford. He understood that perfection at scale beat excellence in scarcity every single time. A Model T was not a particularly good car by objective measures. It was slow, uncomfortable, mechanically unsophisticated. But Ford produced 15 million of them between 1908 and 1927, more cars than the rest of the global automotive industry combined, and in doing so transformed American society completely. This philosophy permeated every aspect of American war production. The B-17 was not the best bomber design theoretically possible. It was simply good enough to be manufactured in enormous quantities, maintained by semi-skilled workers, and flown by pilots with relatively modest training. Boeing produced 12,731 of them. When combined with consolidated B-24 Liberator production 18,482 aircraft, the United States built more four-engine heavy bombers than Germany built combat aircraft of all types during the entire war. The ammunition disparity extended far beyond what individual bombers carried into battle. It reflected a comprehensive logistical philosophy that Germany could not match because Germany had never developed the industrial base to support such wastefulness. A single 50 caliber cartridge consisted of a brass case, primer, propellant, and projectile. Simple components, each manufactured by machines that could produce thousands per hour. The Lake City Army Ammunition Plant in Missouri produced 47 billion rounds of small arms ammunition during the war years. 47 billion. The number was so large as to be functionally meaningless. It represented more ammunition than German factories produced for all weapons systems combined. Small arms, machine guns, cannon, artillery, everything over the same period. This ammunition travelled by train to ports, by ship to England, by truck to airfields, where it was unloaded by logistics personnel and stored in bunkers that held more ammunition than entire Luftwaffe fighter wings possessed. When a B-17 returned from a mission, ground crew could completely reload its ammunition supply in under 2 hours, including time for cleaning and inspecting the guns. The ammunition was there, in effectively infinite supply, because infinite supply was the entire point of American logistics. German fighter pilots returning from combat faced a different reality. Ammunition was carefully controlled, rationed, logged. Ground crew might have to wait for trucks to bring fresh supplies from distant depots. Those trucks might be strafed by enemy fighters or bombed on the roads. The depots themselves might be destroyed. The factories producing the ammunition might have their workforce depleted by conscription or their machinery damaged by bombing. Every link in the chain was vulnerable, and as the war progressed, more links broke every week. By early 1944, some Luftwaffe units were operating under ammunition restrictions that would have seemed insane 2 years earlier. Pilots were instructed to fire only when victory was certain, to conserve cannon ammunition for bombers and use machine guns against fighters, to count their rounds and file reports justifying expenditure. They were warriors reduced to accountants, calculating whether they could afford to shoot at the enemy. Lieutenant Heinz Nock, another survivor and memoirist, described an encounter in March 1944 that perfectly illustrated the psychological impact of this disparity. His Staffel intercepted a formation of B-17 seconds over Brunswick, the same city Stigler had defended in January, the same city that would be attacked 53 times before war's end. Nock positioned himself for a textbook attack from 12 o'clock high, the most dangerous angle for a bomber because it minimized exposure to defensive fire. As he closed to firing range, the lead bomber in the formation opened fire, then the bomber behind it, then the bombers on either side, then bombers so far away Nock could barely see them as distinct aircraft. The Americans had developed a tactic called barrage fire, where every bomber in the formation fired at an attacking fighter regardless of individual range or angle, creating an aerial minefield of intersecting tracer streams. Nock wrote that he could see the bullets. This should have been impossible. A 50 caliber round travels at approximately 900 meters per second, far too fast for the human eye to track, but enough bullets fired densely enough create a visible stream, a river of metal flowing through the air. Nock could see this river, could see his approach vector blocked by it, could see that flying through it was not combat but suicide. He broke off the attack without firing. He had to. Any rational human would have to. But breaking off meant wasting the fuel climbing to attack altitude, wasting the opportunity, wasting the mission. It meant conceding that the enemy could make it simply too expensive to attack, not through superior skill or courage, but through raw abundance of ammunition. This happened again on his second approach. And his third. By the fourth attempt, his fuel was critically low, and his hands were shaking from adrenaline and frustration. He fired from 400 meters, double the ideal range, expended nearly all his cannon ammunition, saw some strikes on a B-17's wing, and dove away. The bomber continued flying. Nock landed with empty guns, an empty fuel tank, and nothing to show for it except another day survived. He was one of the lucky ones. That same day, his Geschwader lost 6 pilots. 4 were killed outright when their aircraft were shot down by bomber defensive fire. 1 bailed out successfully, but was killed when his parachute failed, possibly damaged by bullets during his attack run. 1 made it back to the airfield with catastrophic damage and died when his aircraft collapsed on landing. In exchange, the German fighters claimed 7 bombers destroyed, though post-war analysis suggested the actual number was probably 4. The mathematics were unsustainable. 6 pilots, dead pilots who had taken 2 years to train, who possessed irreplaceable experience and skill, plus 6 fighters destroyed, in exchange for 4 bombers out of a formation of perhaps 300. The Americans could replace 4 B-17 seconds in the time it took to manufacture them, approximately 12 hours of factory time per aircraft, split across multiple production lines. They could replace the crews even faster, because their training pipeline graduated hundreds of new air crews every month from vast training bases in Texas and Arizona and New Mexico, bases so large they would have qualified as major cities in Germany. The symbolic object that haunted German pilots' dreams was not the 50 caliber round itself, though that appeared in enough nightmares. It was the ammunition can. American ground crew handled ammunition in standardized metal cans, holding 105 to 110 rounds depending on configuration. These cans were designed for rapid loading, with mechanisms that allowed fresh cans to be swapped into aircraft in minutes. They were painted olive drab, stenciled with lot numbers and manufacturing dates, as standardized and interchangeable as every other component in the American war machine. German pilots who were shot down and survived to become prisoners of war reported seeing these cans stacked in pyramids beside American bombers at captured airfields, not carefully hoarded in bunkers, not rationed under guard, stacked in open pyramids like firewood, exposed to weather, treated with casual indifference. The guard told one prisoner, Major Gunther Rohl, who survived the war with 275 confirmed victories, that the ammunition was exposed because the storage bunkers were full and they were waiting for trucks to take the excess away. Excess ammunition. The concept was obscene to German pilots, who fired 3-second bursts and counted it a significant expenditure. But it was fundamental truth to the American logistics system, which had been designed from the beginning to produce excess, to overflow with such abundance that waste became inevitable. This abundance extended beyond ammunition to every aspect of bomber operations. B-17 seconds carried enough oxygen for 10 hours of flight at altitude. Luftwaffe fighters carried enough for perhaps 90 minutes. B-17 seconds carried electrical generators powerful enough to run heated flight suits for the entire crew, radar systems, radio equipment, and gun turret motors simultaneously. German fighters often lacked cockpit heating entirely. B-17 seconds carried armor plate weighing nearly half a ton, protecting crew positions from defensive fire. German fighters, pressed to maximize performance, often flew with armor removed to save weight. The entire operational philosophy was different. American bombers were designed with the assumption that some would be lost. This was acceptable, expected, planned for. Mission success was measured statistically. If 70% of bombers reached the target and dropped within 1,000 feet of the aiming point, the mission was successful. Individual aircraft were irrelevant. Individual crews were replaceable. The only thing that mattered was the aggregate effect, the cumulative tonnage of explosives delivered to German industrial centers. German fighters were designed with the opposite assumption, that each aircraft was precious, that each pilot's survival was essential, that losses must be minimized because replacement was difficult or impossible. This led to conservative tactics, to withdrawal when ammunition was exhausted, to abandoning attacks that seemed too dangerous. It led, ultimately, to defeat. The transformation in German tactical thinking occurred gradually, like cancer, until it metastasized into something that looked more like despair than adaptation. By summer 1944, after D-Day, after the losses defending against the invasion forces, after the systematic destruction of synthetic fuel plants that reduced the Luftwaffe to a ghost of its former strength, German fighter tactics had evolved into something their creators would not have recognized 4 years earlier. Sturmbok units emerged, heavily armored and armed FTO 190 seconds, designed to approach bomber formations and simply absorb defensive fire through thick armor plate while closing to point-blank range. They carried 4 20mm cannons, and sometimes additional 30mm cannon in external pods, weapons that sacrificed rate of fire for hitting power. The idea was to achieve 1 or 2 absolutely certain kills per mission, rather than multiple probable kills. This represented the complete inversion of fighter ace philosophy. The individual pilot no longer mattered except as a guidance system for weapons. Survival was secondary to achieving the kill. The aircraft was not a mount for a warrior but a flying gun platform, sacrificial, expendable. Many Sturmbok pilots flew only a handful of missions before being killed or wounded, because the tactics required flying directly into the most intense defensive fire American bombers could generate. And still the Americans came, day after day, their formations barely diminished. For every bomber destroyed over the target, 2 more appeared in its place. For every crew killed, another crew fresh from training in Arizona took its place. The American industrial machine had achieved perpetual motion, feeding itself, growing stronger as Germany grew weaker. Major Walther Dahl, who commanded a Sturmbok Geschwader, recorded his thoughts after a mission in July 1944, where his unit destroyed 14 B-17 seconds, a spectacular success by any measure, at the cost of 11 pilots killed and 9 aircraft destroyed. He wrote that he felt like he was trying to stop an avalanche by throwing stones at it. Each stone might dislodge a boulder, might change the avalanche's path by inches, but the avalanche continued regardless. The only question was how many stones he would throw before being buried. This was the final evolution of the fighter ace mythology, the realization that individual heroism was meaningless against systematic industrial superiority, that all the skill and courage and sacrifice in the world could not overcome an enemy who treated war the way Ford treated automobile production, as a problem of scale, efficiency, and resources. The ammunition disparity manifested itself in the physical appearance of returning aircraft in ways that were psychologically devastating to German pilots. B-17 seconds that returned to England after missions over Germany often landed with hundreds of rounds still remaining in their ammunition cans. Gunners who had engaged enemy fighters throughout the mission, who had fired thousands of rounds at targets from takeoff to landing, stepped out of their aircraft with ammunition to spare. This was not because they were particularly restrained. This was because American logistics packed so much ammunition into each bomber that it was physically impossible to expend it all during a single mission unless something catastrophic happened. Photographs from 1,944 show ground crew at English airfields unloading unused ammunition from returned bombers, stacking the cans beside the aircraft, sometimes simply leaving them because there was no immediate need to reload. The ammunition would sit there overnight, in the open, guarded only casually if at all, because theft was not a concern when infinite replacements existed. German pilots who saw these photographs during intelligence briefings or after capture reported the same reaction: disbelief followed by hollow laughter. They were fighting for scraps while the enemy drowned in abundance. They were rationing bullets while the enemy left them stacked in the rain. But the true symbolism of the ammunition can extend it beyond simple quantity to the philosophical difference it represented. Each can of American ammunition embodied a logistics chain that stretched back across the Atlantic to factories in Missouri and Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. It embodied railroads that ran on time, ships that crossed oceans safely, trucks that delivered supplies without being strafed. It embodied an economy so vast that total war actually increased civilian living standards instead of destroying them. It embodied a nation that treated war as a problem to be solved through production, organization, and systematic application of resources rather than through individual heroism or ideological purity. The Luftwaffe had aces. Men with 200, 250, 275 confirmed victories. Men who had personally destroyed more enemy aircraft than many Allied squadrons combined. Men whose names were legendary, whose tactics were studied, whose courage was unquestionable. But the Luftwaffe did not have ammunition. It did not have fuel. It did not have spare parts. It did not have the industrial capacity to replace losses faster than they occurred. And so, despite having some of the finest fighter pilots in history, despite tactical innovation and technological advancement and fanatical dedication, it lost. The Americans, by contrast, had adequate pilots, good aircraft, and effectively infinite supplies of everything. They won not because they produced heroes, but because they produced ammunition cans by the millions and shipped them wherever they were needed without pause or shortage or rationing. They won because they understood that modern war was not won by the warrior class, but by the factory workers and logistics personnel and quartermasters who ensured that every soldier, every gunner, every aircraft had more of everything than they could possibly use. Franz Stigler, the pilot who began our story climbing to intercept altitude on that January morning over Brunswick, survived the war. He survived by skill and luck in equal measure, accumulating 28 confirmed victories before the final collapse. After Germany's surrender, he emigrated to Canada, where he worked as an ordinary machinist, never speaking about his war service, living the quiet life of a man who had seen too much history. In 1990, he was contacted by an American former B-17 pilot named Charlie Brown, who had been searching for 47 years for the German pilot who had spared his crippled bomber over Germany in December 1943, had escorted it to the coast instead of finishing it off, had violated every rule and regulation because some human decency survived even in the midst of total war. Through remarkable detective work, Brown found Stigler, and the two men became friends in their final years, united by shared trauma and mutual respect. They spoke often about what the war had meant, what they had learned. Brown, who had flown missions where his B-17 returned with more than 1,000 bullet holes but still flew, who had seen gunners expend their entire ammunition load in a single mission and still land safely, struggled to explain to Stigler what American abundance had felt like from inside the bomber. "We never worried about running out of ammunition," Brown said in an interview near the end of his life. "That wasn't something we thought about. We worried about fighters, about flak, about getting lost or running out of fuel. But ammunition? There was always more ammunition." Stigler, for his part, tried to explain what it felt like to attack a formation, knowing you had 40 seconds of firing time total, knowing that if you missed, you were useless, knowing that the enemy could spray bullets like water and still have reserves. It was like fighting a thunderstorm, he said. You might dodge one lightning bolt, maybe two, but eventually the storm would find you. And the storm never ran out of lightning. This conversation between two old men who had tried to kill each other half a century earlier captured the essential truth that separated victory from defeat. America treated war as an engineering problem. They calculated how much ammunition was needed to suppress fighter attacks statistically, multiplied by a safety factor, added redundancy for failed equipment, and installed that quantity in every bomber. They did this not because they expected every bomber to expend all ammunition, but because ammunition was cheap compared to aircraft and crews. They optimized for mission success rather than resource efficiency, and in doing so created a military machine that was impossible to defeat through conventional means. The Germans, operating from a position of scarcity, optimized for resource efficiency. They built lighter, faster fighters that carried less ammunition because less weight meant better performance. They trained pilots to make every shot count because they could not afford to waste rounds. They developed tactics around conservation and precision because abundance was never an option. And because they optimized for efficiency rather than effectiveness, they lost. The epilogue to the ammunition disparity came in the form of numbers so stark they seem fictional. Between January 1943 and May 1945, the 8th Air Force alone, one of several American air forces operating in Europe, flew 327,000 bomber sorties over Germany and occupied Europe. Each bomber sortie represented an aircraft carrying approximately 8,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. This yields approximately 2.6 billion rounds carried into combat by American bombers in Europe, not counting ammunition carried by fighters, not counting other air forces, not counting the Pacific Theater. German ammunition production for all aircraft-mounted weapons from 1943 to 1945 totaled approximately 3.2 billion rounds across all calibers. The Luftwaffe had more total ammunition than the USAAF carried into combat, but that ammunition was distributed across thousands of airfields, hundreds of units, multiple fronts. No single German fighter wing ever possessed the concentrated firepower that an American bomber group carried into combat on a routine mission. This disparity in logistics, in industrial capacity, in fundamental approach to warfare, determined the conflict's outcome as surely as any battle. Germany lost the war not primarily on the battlefield, but in the factories, the shipyards, the training bases, the logistics depots. They lost because they were trying to fight an industrial war with an artisan's mindset, because they believed that individual excellence could overcome systematic superiority. The fighter ace, that romantic figure who dominated military aviation from 1914 forward, died somewhere over Germany in 1944, killed not by enemy guns but by irrelevance. Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring ace in history with 352 confirmed victories, could not change Germany's fate. Hans-Joachim Marseille, the Star of Africa with 158 victories, could not prevent Allied air superiority in the Mediterranean. Gunther Roll's 275 victories could not protect German cities from being bombed into rubble. All their skill, all their courage, all their victories were drops of water thrown against an ocean tide. The Americans understood what the Germans learned too late. Modern war is won by the society that can produce the most, ship it the farthest, and sustain operations the longest. Individual heroism becomes quaint when one side arrives at the battlefield with effectively infinite ammunition and the other side is counting rounds. Every ammunition can that returned to England still partially full represented a choice, the choice to value abundance over scarcity, to optimize for effectiveness over efficiency, to treat war as a production problem rather than a test of warrior virtue. That choice, multiplied across millions of cans, billions of rounds, thousands of aircraft, decided the war's outcome as certainly as any strategic decision made by generals. The sky above Brunswick is quiet now, marked only by contrails from commercial aviation following corridors established by international agreement. The factories that once produced aircraft and ammunition are gone, replaced by light industry and office parks. The airfields where Stigler scrambled to intercept enemy bombers are now residential developments, the concrete runways broken up and buried under suburban homes. But the lesson remains, carved into history with the indelible permanence of statistical truth. Abundance defeats excellence. Production defeats heroism. The society that brings more of everything to the battlefield wins, regardless of individual skill or courage or will. The ammunition can, that simple metal box holding 105 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, represented this truth more perfectly than any strategic analysis or theoretical framework. German aces could not believe American planes carried more ammunition than their entire squadron, because accepting that fact meant accepting that they had lost before the first shot was fired. It meant accepting that all their training, all their tradition, all their mythology of the warrior elite was irrelevant against an enemy who had industrialized violence to the point where human variables ceased to matter. They were the finest fighter pilots in history, and they lost to a country that treated bullets the way other nations treated sand, as an effectively infinite resource to be used without meaningful constraint. This is not romantic. This is not dramatic. This is simply the mathematical truth of industrial warfare. Quantity has a quality all its own, and when the quantity differential is extreme enough, excellence becomes meaningless. The ammunition cans remain in museums now, painted and labelled, artifacts of a war that killed 60 million people and ended with cities turned to ash. Visitors look at them without understanding, seeing only old metal boxes. But those boxes contain the secret of modern war, the truth that separates victors from vanquished. Bring more. Bring so much more that the enemy cannot conceive of matching it. Bring such abundance that waste becomes strategy and excess becomes doctrine. Bring enough that every soldier, every gunner, every aircraft never questions whether supplies will be sufficient, because sufficiency is guaranteed by the crushing weight of industrial production. This was America's gift to modern warfare, not tactical innovation or strategic brilliance, but the simple brutal fact of overwhelming material superiority. And against that superiority, all the fighter aces in the world could do nothing except die bravely, kill until they were killed, and wonder at the endless abundance that buried them. The sky remembers. The ammunition cans remember. History remembers. And the lesson, written in brass casings and empty magazines and fallen heroes, remains as relevant today as in January 1944. Wars are won, not by warriors, but by factories, not by courage, but by capacity, not by aces, but by accountants who ensure that every unit has more than enough of everything, always. That is the truth that German aces could not believe, even as it killed them. That is the truth that ended the mythology of individual heroism in modern war. That is the truth embodied in those simple metal cans, stacked carelessly beside bombers on English airfields, more ammunition than the enemy could produce in months, treated as casually as firewood, because abundance makes all things disposable. In the end, Germany had heroes. America had ammunition. One of these won the war.